the Daily Evolver. Today, I'm joined by Corey DeVos, Editor-in-Chief of Integral Life. Hey, Corey.
Hey, my man. Good to be back.
Yes, good to have you. And today, we have a very special guest with us, Chris Grosso, who is an integral teacher and author who I met for the first time over New Year's at the What Now conference that Integral Life put on. And Chris did a presentation there that I think really transmitted what makes Chris so special. And there's a freshness, there's a youth, there's this sort of living proof of the power of his own teaching. And you may know of Chris. He wrote the book Integral or Indie Spiritualist a while back that got a lot of attention in the integral world. And he has just released a new book that I love. I'm just really into it. And it's called Dead Set on Living, making the difficult but beautiful journey from fucking up to waking up. So welcome, Chris Grosso.
Thank you, Mr. Salzman and Mr. DeVos. It is a pleasure and an honor to be in your, even though it's the interwebs, in your presence again. Thanks for having me on the show.
In our virtual presence.
Yes, virtual presence. Here we are.
Everybody who's listening, yes.
Yes.
From one fuck up to another. It's good to have you here, buddy.
And that's how we get it started.
Yeah, well, that's where I'd like to start, actually. You know, you talk about fucking up to waking up, and you know of what you speak. And,
I'm a pro. I'm a pro.
And a lot of your book is about your story and also the lessons from your story that are really eclectic, really beautiful, really well put together. And like I said, I really love it. I feel a transmission coming through this book.
Thank you.
So I guess I just start there and ask you to tell us a little about the story and the book and how you got this going.
Yeah, I mean, so it is my third book, which just came out on Tuesday with Simon & Schuster and Gallery, who's a subdivision. And I'm
going to put it up on the screen here.
Oh, cool. Yay. There it is.
Yeah.
It was a real cool honor to have Mr. Bam Margera write that endorsement.
Yeah, that's awesome. My daughter loved the Dragonfly too, man.
Oh yeah, it seemed to be getting a lot of nice feedback about that.
I was curious about that. You put the guy from Jackass on your cover, even though you have Jack Cornfield and Ram Dass and Ken Wilber and Sharon Salzberg and all these A-list people on the inside.
That's right.
But I love it.
I call that skillful means.
Skillful means. Well, I mean, I did put him on the cover because he has gone through his own struggles with addiction severely. And he was actually on, besides being known for his role in Jackass and the CKY videos, he was also on a VH1 show like 2 years ago. It was like Family Rehab or something like that about his alcoholism. He lost his best friend to a drunk driving accident, and he had always partied to excess, but it really went down a very dark road for him. And so his sister-in-law, whose husband is the drummer of the band CKY, not to be confused with the videos, she had somehow gotten a copy of my books and churned. Or here's the story real quick. Bam was over their house, I guess, and saw the books and was like, "Oh, you know that author?" Or do you know that author? And she was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "That's crazy. Hawk," meaning Tony Hawk, the skateboarder, told me to read those books because Tony Hawk had endorsed my first book, which that in and of itself was a huge honor. Yeah, I still have, like, from the 80s, I still have my very first Tony Hawk skateboard. Over on my fridge, I have a postcard. I wrote Tony Hawk in 1988, and he wrote me back, and I have his autograph from 88. I actually have I don't know if anyone can see if there's viewers, but a Tony Hawk tattoo. So, I mean, I'm a big Tony Hawk fan. So anyways, it was just really neat for me because yes, Ram Dass, Ken Wilber, these are my spiritual teachers. But growing up, my real first introduction to spirituality, albeit unbeknownst to me, because I didn't have spiritual context to put around it, was punk rock, was hardcore music, was underground hip hop, skateboarding, things that were raw and passionate that began to I know it's cliche, but really to unplug me from the matrix and teach me to start thinking for myself and questioning everything. A teaching you hear often in Buddhism and many of the great wisdom traditions. So I kind of...
That's interesting to hear to me, Chris, because I didn't go through any of that because
Sure.
I'm old.
You're young.
But so you hear punk rock, you see these guys that it seems so transgressive and so, dangerous and so negative, if you don't know any better.
Right.
But you're saying that this actually expanded the playing field for you.
Big time. I mean, I was around 13 when I was introduced to punk rock and hardcore. I'd gone through the alternative music phase with like Soundgarden and Nine Inch Nails and Nirvana, Pearl Jam, all that stuff. And I still love those bands to this day. But for me, it was the first time I had a friend. He was 2 years older than me. He put a 7-inch on. And I remember the raw passion. It like cut right to the core of me. And I didn't recognize it as a spiritual experience until fast forward maybe 10 years. I know we're jumping around a bit here, but the first time I ever heard a Krishna Das album, who is a Grammy-nominated kirtan musician. And I remember putting that album on, and that was the second time in my life that I had that same experience of hearing my first punk hardcore record, where it just cut right to the core, like of the essence of my being. Two, totally different sides of the musical spectrum, but they had the same impact. And the thing with punk and hardcore, it is often misconstrued as negative. There certainly is negativity around it, but there are a slew of positive bands, positive messages, unity, coming together. There's a lot of just exceptionally positive stuff happening there. People that volunteer their time, whether it's in a soup kitchen or with Food Not Bombs, all sorts of wonderful things happening. But sure, there's also negative too. Bad Brains, one of the biggest punk bands of all time, their biggest thing is called PMA, Positive Mental Attitude. PMA, that's like you see tons of people.
That's like Norman Vincent Peale, for God's sake.
See, so there is a lot of crossover. And the cool thing to me is, so I'm turning 40 this year. And so a lot of these like older punk rock hardcore people like myself, I'm running into in various like Buddhist settings or at a Ram Dass retreat or a Ken Wilber event, or there are, because they got involved in that because they were looking for something more. They weren't finding it at face value in life. And as you get older, for many of us, it's led us towards the spiritual path and exploring there, going inside rather than out. So I owe a huge debt of gratitude to punk rock and hardcore and metal and, again, underground hip hop. And I love jazz and all. I'm a musician, so I have a very diverse taste in music. I was going to say eclectic, but my girlfriend, side note, I did an interview the other day and she was in the other room and it was like a half-hour interview. And I'm like, oh, that went pretty well. I'm thinking to myself. And the first thing she says to me, and we joke about this, so I can say, she's like, you say eclectic too much instead of like, instead of nice job. Like that was great. That's the first thing she says. I'm like, really? Like, not like, hey, that you said some good stuff. She's like, well, no, that goes without saying. I'm around you all the time. I know you say good stuff, but we need to get you at the thesaurus or something. And
let me just say that just a comment here about one of the reasons I loved your book so much.
Yeah,
is that I think of it as spiritually promiscuous, in the sense of a lot of good integral people. You're out there, and what you do in this book is you talk to spiritual teachers who have meant something to you, who have given you a piece of the puzzle that has helped you turn your life around and become who you are. And rather than just an interview, you actually, in a way, translate their teachings into your own life, into your own words. And I have to say, in a couple cases, better than they do for me. But be that neither here nor there. Sure. But you're getting, it's literally multi-perspectival, and yet tied together in an integration that I think is really something.
Well, I appreciate that. And giving respect where respect is due, that's where my friend Alice Peck comes into play. The book is by me. These are my conversations. And they were conversations. They weren't really necessarily interviews, but she was so helpful in helping me make them a narrative. We didn't want to do an anthology, just this interview. You know, we wanted it to be a very intimate exploration, going back to your original question of, you know, why this book essentially is, you know, exploring why people return to these self-defeating behaviors even when they know they're going to harm them. And so in my case, it was inspired my main experience of pain and suffering in life. Not my only, but my main has been drugs and alcohol, and predominantly alcohol. And I have relapsed a number of times, stumbled, staggered, picked myself back up, you know, spent years in sobriety and meditation. And for one reason or another, I would end up going back to that. And so it's like, what the hell is going on? You know, and I'd been doing a lot of work on myself and seeing a therapist, attending 12-step fellowships, writing on steps. And I do want to be clear before I go any further that I don't advocate. I share about my experience, but I don't advocate one form of anything over another, like one form of spirituality, one form of recovery, one form of well-being. I take a very integral approach. The ILP book, Integral Life Practice, has been huge for me in my life because it did have so many diverse practices, and I love the like 1, 2, 3 modules, and so you know that was a big influence as well as I approached this book, because being the diverse / eclectic, now I'm going to need a third word, person that I am, and having taught so many workshops now at this point and spoken at conferences and festivals, and again, having the honor to be there with you guys out in Colorado over New Year's recently, what I've learned, if nothing else, is that we are each, and then this probably should go without saying, but we're each very unique individuals. And so what works for one person is not going to work for another necessarily. And that's why it was so important for me to take this exploration of not only why do we return to these behaviors, and let me be clear, this is not just a book about drugs and alcohol. I mean, it explores it all, like from sex to shopping to gambling, internet, television, video games. I mean, whatever we use as a means of numbing out, of, you know, aversion, essentially. And not that any of those things in and themselves are wrong, but when done to excess, or again, as a means of aversion, that's where it becomes an issue. And I can put a check mark to many of the aforementioned things aside from drugs and alcohol in my case. But so that's why I wanted to explore that question through all of these various viewpoints, and whether it's a spiritual tradition, whether it's an addiction expert, whether it's a neuroscientist, but in a way that is very easily accessible for any reader. Anytime I write a book, what I do is I try to think about my 19-year-old self, and I do that because that's where I cross that line from abuse of drugs and alcohol over to addiction. And I try to think, well, you know, what if I had this book in my hand at that time? Would that have made a difference? I obviously can't answer that question. Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe it would have sent me more in a trajectory of a healthy life. Maybe not. But I do write with that in mind, and I do have a great passion for working with youth, and I'm honored and blessed to work with. At biweekly, I do a workshop with roughly 13 to 20-year-olds down at a youth mental health and well-being facility. Aside from the conferences and whatnot. So, you know,
and are you working with the spiritual principles with these kids?
Yeah, essentially. Well, what I've been doing is I go in there, and I'm, as I do in my books and my talks, and every time I go there, because they're only there for X amount of days. So bi-weekly, I'm often meeting new residents that are coming in. And I let them know very much right off the bat that, look, this is my experience. And just like I said earlier, what I share, and I try to make it more interactive. I don't want to sit there and just talk at them. Who wants to be talked at? You know, I want to hear from them. I want to address specifically what's going on for those who are comfortable sharing. But yes, I do. Like, I talk about meditation. I try to present it in a more of a broad fashion using, you know, mindfulness techniques or certain breath practices, like whether it's 4-4-6 or 4-7-8 or whatever. So I'm not pushing any kind of spiritual or religious agenda on them. You know, I'm trying to meet, and not just with youth, with anyone, I try to meet people where they're at in a way that will allow them to be open to the message that I'm bringing. And essentially that message is just, how can I help you in your healing journey?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And Chris, I think this is where I find you to be a tremendously gifted and skilled teacher.
Thank you.
You're not, and cycling back to the beginning of the conversation, this is why I was excited to see Bam Margera on the cover of your book, because what you're doing is you're bringing these teachings, you're bringing this Dharma to an audience that otherwise might never be exposed to it. Right. If you would put Ram Dass on the cover, if you put Ken Wilber on the cover, I mean, it's not to say that Ram Dass is following and, the integral audience won't get a lot out of this book. They certainly will.
Sure.
Right? But we're irradiated with this stuff, with these perspectives, and to actually find a way to communicate, the amazing sort of healing capacities and the transmission of sort of a deeper liberation than your addiction is going to bring you to groups of people who otherwise would not be necessarily seasoned for receiving this kind of message. I think is a gift, and for me is exactly it's right on schedule. I've been talking for a while how I think that the next sort of maturation point for Integral is going to be moving beyond us getting really good at talking to each other, which we are, and that's what the last 15 years have really been about.
Yeah.
And it's about turning around and re-engaging the world and packaging this wisdom in a way that can actually create value for people, can actually move the needle in their personal lives. Mm. And for Jeff and I, this is a tremendously personal conversation as well. We, Jeff and I have a mutual friend and colleague who used to work with Daily Evolver, who lost his life to addiction.
Yes.
So it's it's not to say that just because you're again irradiated in integral perspectives, that certainly doesn't mean you're immune to
of course.
sort of sliding down into those holes. But just the fact that you're out there and you're doing what you're doing and you're demonstrating these not just the wisdom that you've accumulated, but the capacity to communicate that wisdom to people who really need to hear that message the most, I think is amazing. So props to you, man.
Well, sir, you make me feel all warm and fuzzy. Thank you. No, really appreciate that. But that is why I, not just with putting certain people's names on the cover, but I try to get, all these different endorsements from different perspectives. I was very blessed with my second book, not only to have Ken write the foreword, but to have Jeff Bridges of all people endorse it and then tweet about it. That's crazy to me. But like with this book, as Jeff mentioned, it has a list of really wonderful contributors, people that have deeply impacted my life in one way or another. Hence, they're in the book, otherwise they wouldn't be. But when it comes to endorsements, having people like Robert Thurman, who I deeply respect, writing an endorsement, or Raghunath Ray Capo, singer of Youth of Today, one of the oldest, most well-known punk bands, and like I said, Bam, or Richard Rohr, a very well-known Christian. I don't know if he's Christian mystic or what he technically calls himself, but with all of my books, I try to get a very eclectic mix of people, of words, not looking for name recognition, but really so people can see that this book isn't just for one type of audience. It's
that's right. Yeah. Constellating these very different personalities. When I just read through the names on the back of the book, and I put them together, and I say, man, I want to go to that party.
Right? Wouldn't that be interesting?
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. That would be something. I want to go too. Let's make it happen.
Well, and you also point out, we're all addicted to something. I mean, it's just the nature of being human, at least at this stage of development, that we are just, we find ourselves unhealthily attracted to all sorts of things. Yeah. And this, and the antidote to that is continued development, actually, which comes from practice. Yeah. And so what I'd like to ask you, Chris, is, so you've kissed a lot of frogs. I don't mean to be glib about that, but you got a lot of transmissions. What what's the integration here? I mean, what do we need that we don't have? What are we ignoring? Where are our blind spots, particularly with integralists, but also with the people that you're specifically talking to, who are recovering? Just give us a little bit of some of the actual spiritual download.
Well, again, I can only really share from my own personal experience. As I mentioned, we're all unique individuals, so we have our own unique set of circumstances, and I honor that fact very much, and that's why I always try to be very clear. But first and foremost, and Ken talks a lot about this in his chapter in the book, which has been very big in my own healing journey, is reintegrating and re-owning my shadow material, which is to say that unconscious mess that is deep down in there, really getting in touch with it through various practices that I've learned from Ken and others. I see a wonderful therapist on a weekly basis who helps me, and it's not talk therapy, he goes deep. It's more like, let's get into your emotions and feel your feelings and what's coming up and what's blocking that, and let's remove that and let's go deeper. And my old college professor, actually, who was like a second mom to me, she saw him for many years. And when I told her I want to get back in therapy, she's like, this is your guy. And I trust her implicitly. She's the one who actually set me on the spiritual path in the first place. And I'll never forget, I was wary. I'm wary of therapists because in many cases they can do more harm than good. And I've seen that happen. But when I sat down, the first book I noticed on his shelf was Gabor Mate's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which is huge for me, been very influential. And as soon as I saw that, it was just like, okay, I'm in good hands. So I'm very lucky. But really, I think a big part of it, again, at least for me, is the willingness to become uncomfortable, to get raw, to get vulnerable, and to go within and explore these places inside of ourselves that we, whether they're unconscious or they're, semi-conscious, we kind of know we're there, but we're pushing them away, to really get into that stuff. For me, that's where my real healing journey began, sifting through all that wreckage that was in there. Now, I know in my case, it's a bit more extreme than maybe a lot of your listeners because of the addictive life I've lived, which has led me to nearly die on a number of occasions, and suicide attempts, and jail cells and emergency rooms and psychiatric hospitals and detoxes and rehabs, and on it goes, and more than one occasion with all of them. But again, that's what led me to write this book. What's going on? Why are we doing that? And the beautiful thing is, not to get off topic, but I forgot to mention earlier, what was so important for me with this book is not only is each chapter a different narrative conversation with what we could call, quote unquote, an expert in their field, but it provides a correlating practice at the end. So, talking is great. Let's get the conversation started. Let's start thinking about things. But when we begin to practice, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where, in my experience at least, the true healing begins. And I love how Ken talks about waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. He wrote a lot at length about that in the introduction to my second book, Everything Mind. And, he talks about how a lot of people are great in one area and not great in another. And I took that very seriously when I read that. And so I'm very cautious in my life to try to be even on all levels. Of course, on any given day, one will be higher than the other, but as long as my awareness is there, and that's why taking an integral approach for me works well. So it is various shadow practices. It is attending a 12-step fellowship and having a sponsor and writing on steps. It is eating well. It is waking up and going to the gym and working out usually about 6 times a week. It really is a mind, body, spirit approach, honoring all parts, my entire essence of being, so to speak. So that would, and I see a lot of people that could really use that. They're doing great in one area, but they're lacking in another. And that's not me making a judgment on them. That's just something I notice, you know, and that happens for me too. I am so far from perfect. I mean, you know, as you've seen in this book and my past two books, I throw myself under the bus all the time. Like, because I am a constant screw up, you know, and I make that very clear. I am no expert. I am not a spiritual teacher. I am just someone who is blessed to be alive. You guys mentioned you lost someone in the integral community. I lose several friends a year at least to this thing. Last year, I lost a few people in their 20s to addiction, you know, or even to suicide because of untreated depression. But that's one area I see, like, you know, we need to be willing to go deeper, push a little bit further, and not push ourselves to the extreme where we're going to, you know, cause unneeded depression or anxiety, but really the willingness to go to these places that aren't comfortable. However, once we start working through it, that's where, once we begin healing and reintegrating them, we do feel more peace and more contentment and more comfort in our life on a daily basis. Not always, because it's life, and we know life will, you know, it can be a total shitstorm. Just yesterday, as an example, my girlfriend and we were getting ready to go to my friend's 40th birthday party, and literally like 15, 20 minutes before we were going, we had a call from her mother that their family dog needed to be put to sleep. And so I went from being very excited and joyous, you know, with my friend's gift, his 40th birthday, a dear friend, going to go see a lot of friends I haven't seen in a long time, a joyous celebration, to ending up in the veterinarian office on a Sunday afternoon with her sister, her mother, and a family friend as they put their dog to sleep. And I've had to put, you know, but my family, at least, we've lost at least, I think, probably half a dozen dogs, and it brought a lot of that up for me. And you know, I spent the afternoon, a good part of it, there with them, crying, hugging, working through it, and it brought up a lot of shit for me, and that's life. But I was able to breathe through it. I was able to integrate practices that I write about in this book or I teach. So I didn't have to go out and pick up a drink or a drug or, you know, a pint of ice cream. And again, and sometimes a pint of ice cream, God damn it, is called for. So I'm not saying don't do it.
You can do a Haagen-Dazs meditation. That's totally acceptable.
Right. So yes, mindful Haagen-Dazs meditation. We should write a book, Corey. You know, let's get on this. $1 million idea right there. But yeah, so anyways, and then it just becomes like riding a bike, you know, and then the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. There will be good days and bad. I love in the Four Agreements, how Don Miguel Ruiz, you know, those four agreements are so simple, but he also points out in a very clear, matter-of-fact way that our 100% one day is not going to be the same the next. Right. And honoring that, you know, and just showing up and doing our best each day that we can, you know, and what else can you really ask for in life? So, yeah.
We had one of the epigrams in your book. It just hit me between the eyes, and it's something I've been thinking about in general, about where we're going evolutionarily. And the epigram is from POS, who I don't know who that is, and it's from the song "Let It Rattle." Yeah. But the line is, "There ain't nobody to be pretty for. Fuck it, let it rattle."
Yeah.
And there's something about that where we all realize that here we are, we're these human beings in this you know, sort of heroic adventure of our lives. And none of us is even close to perfect. And at some point, that realization is so liberating that you don't have to be pretty for anybody anymore. No. And you don't have to be pretty for yourself.
Yeah. Right.
And what a relief.
How true. And I actually love that line so much. I used it in my second book and my third book. You know, it's like, I don't give a shit. It fits here. I'm going to use it again, you know, but just quick again, credit where it's due. POS is a wonderful underground hip hop artist. He's a member of the collective Doomtree, who falls under the Rhyme Sayers label, which features or is run by Slug of Atmosphere. And I'm, like I said, a big fan of underground hip hop. So, and I love him because this is a dude who came up from the punk rock scene, but yet he's now this amazing hip hop artist who will incorporate bands which you're probably not familiar with, but like ISIS or Fugazi or, you know, these classic bands. I know Corey knows who Fugazi is. But anyway, so yeah, but that line, it just so deeply resonates with me. And that goes back to those punk rock ethics. Like I have felt that way since 13 or 14. You know, I've always been a black sheep in my family, in my rural community. To this day, often when I go to events, even at Integral, everyone was so kind and loving, and it was wonderful to meet them. But, you know, my girlfriend Lacey Ann and I, we kind of stood out like sore thumbs with the exception of Corey and maybe one or two other people. But, you know, here we are wearing our band shirts or, you know, Lacey Ann with her crazy look. And, you know, I mean, she's gorgeous. And, what's that, Corey?
Eating ice in the background.
Eating ice. Yeah. I was with her last night, and sure enough, eating ice. I was making fun of her because she's shaking her cup violently, and she's like, "I have to get the perfect piece of ice." Anyways, but even like the thing is, like, and I'm glad you brought her up because to me, like, I consider her a dear spiritual teacher. You know, it's not just about the Ken Wilbers and the Ram Dasses and the other people in this book, or the Ramana Maharshis or Nagarjunas, excuse me. Like, of course, you know, my bookshelves are littered with their works, but I love how it's probably not Krishna Das was the first one to say it, but he often talks about life is the guru, life is the teacher, regardless of whether you believe in gurus or not. That's neither here nor there, but you know, I look at when I go in to do that work with youth or any workshop, part of the reason I make it very interactive is somewhat selfishly. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely altruistic. Like I learn just as much from listening to other people as I do sharing in my own experience. And I find that so much with my girlfriend. You know, she has been such an incredible teacher to me, you know, someone who doesn't really have a specific spiritual practice. She doesn't really meditate or do yoga or anything like that. Doesn't read the texts. I know she's a fan of the Four Agreements, but other than that, she is one of the most kind, compassionate, caring, loving human beings I've ever met. You know, and to me, just watching the way she is in life, and when something negative happens, she is so wonderful at like doing her best in a very real and authentic way because it's natural. She's not forcing it to find the positive. It's like, wow, like I feel like she puts me to shame, to be honest with you. And it's like, man, you should be giving this workshop, not me, you know, but that's not of her interest. So anyways, but that's why I'm grateful.
It's so beautiful and such a beautiful practice, actually.
Yeah.
To see what this person in front of you has to teach you.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And to really look at them.
Yes.
And to really penetrate and to receive.
Yeah.
And also, in a way, what we have to teach ourselves at some point, once we really get that we can. And you talked about it a minute ago, where you talked about the shadow practice, which is basically the practice of turning towards our pain.
Right. Yes.
Instead of away from it.
Right.
And that the metabolization it's basically from a Buddhist perspective, the burning of the karma of that painful experience is liberating. It may just be an onion skin of liberation, but it's still liberation.
Yes.
And that becomes a practice. And once you start seeing how that works and how effective it is, you know, then you can that becomes a new way of living.
Absolutely. And that's why I love the practice of Tonglen as well, you know, breathing in the pain and others' pain. And, you know, I share that in this book. I think actually I might have shared it in all three of my books, but it's just one of those practices, you know, where it's like, instead of avoiding the pain, let's lean into it. I do say, though, that there are certain occasions where it is, I believe, and you know, Corey and I were just joking about it, but a Haagen-Dazs pint meditation, you know, like it is okay to step away and put some space, because some things in life are just so heavy that in the moment they are too much. You know, they really are. And
yeah,
it
I
is.
had an experience of that when I was a really intense meditator and went to retreats all the time, and I was having an anxiety period.
Yeah.
And that's sort of my natural thing.
Yeah.
And I was flop sweating onto the cushion.
Mm.
And there was no more point in me being ever more mindful of my torment.
Yeah, totally.
So I got the fuck up and left, which I'd never done, never thought I would ever do. And it was one of the best things I've ever done.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Sometimes you got to tap out. I mean, sometimes you really have to tap out. I mean, tap out mindfully. Know that you're tapping out, but let yourself, give yourself that sort of that space, that forgiveness. Let yourself be vulnerable. Let yourself be a mess for a little while, and then I'll sort of the things that you should be doing will you can return to that later on. But
Agree.
tap out if you need to tap out.
Absolutely. I often joke like there's no trophies given out in spirituality, you know, so it's like
there should be.
I mean, I know we have the Watkins 100.
I was just gonna say we have Watkins giving out
I won a trophy.
But that aside, there's no trophies for that.
Well, and so, sometimes the spiritual response is not the appropriate response. Sometimes the answer is not to drop yourself on a cushion, because what you're actually doing right there is ignoring whatever the irritant happens to be, and you're trying to bypass it, and you're actually avoiding where the real work is. And and Chris, I love how you actually describe sort of the feeling of shadow work, because I feel like your experiences in the punk and hardcore scene actually sort of primed you in a certain sense for the discomfort that shadow work really brings, because punk is the sound of the exposed nerve, right?
Yeah,
punk is the sound of a disassociated sort of identity, sort of a disassociated collective identity, and trying to sort of reintegrate. It's being an irritant, right? Yeah. And that sound can be so abrasive. I mean, you walk into a punk club or a hardcore club, if you're not accustomed to it, you might just bounce off, like a meteor bouncing off the atmosphere, because you can't handle that level of sort of friction. But if you can acclimate to it, if you can let yourself sort of ride that wave and let that abrasiveness take you where it's supposed to take you, it'll probably dislodge something. And you know what? It's not a comfortable process. It's not a beautiful process. I love that lyric. It reminded me of Faith No More. Don't look at me, I'm ugly in the morning. Right? I mean, there's this sort of like, let's find a way not to sort of bang on this ugly thing until it looks pretty, but let's find a way to make ugly itself something beautiful, right? Which I think is something that punk and hardcore and bands that you and I both love, like Faith No More, do really, really well. Is it's sort of it's deliberately atonal. It's deliberately sort of creating these resistance layers just so you can fucking break through them.
So well said.
And reintegrate and sort of recover that energy. But shadow work, it ain't pretty. It's loud. It hurts. It's painful. Yes. It's uncomfortable, and you kind of have to learn to sit in that fire.
Yeah, and you're right. It's a great primer. In the introduction to my first book, Noah Levine, who wrote Dharma Punks, he wrote the foreword, not the introduction, and he's son to Stephen and Andrea Levine, who were. Well, Stephen's passed on. Andrea is still with us, but they've been hugely influential in my life as well in their teachings. But Noah at one point says, one of the most compassionate things we can do in certain circumstances is to say no, or is to churn up the radio really loud. Like to give ourselves that space. And with punk, I wish I remembered the quote verbatim, but going back in my first book, I quoted a friend who was quoting a friend, but he said something about how. It was so well said too, but something to the effect of, for us at that time, punk was a last-ditch effort to find something real and authentic in a world increasingly devoid of it. It was worded more eloquently than that, but something to that effect. And again, that's why I said, like, it's so interesting to me now, almost being 40, that was when I was 13, meeting and running into so many old school punk rock and hardcore kids, like they grew up and found their way to Buddhism or Hinduism or some form of mystic tradition, or just a general interfaith spiritual practice, whatever that might look like. it's great. But, of course, it's not limited to that. I've met so many beautiful, wonderful people that could give two shits about hardcore music. I've also met plenty of spiritual, quote unquote, people who have given me shit for the t-shirts I wear or the bands I listen to. I remember when, I think it was my last book, Everything Mind, came out, Ram Dass and Tara Brach and Ken, they were all lovely enough to share about it on their social medias and whatnot, as they did with this book. But I remember specifically on a post on Ram Dass's Facebook page and Tara Brach's, I don't remember wording, but they were both similar from different people. But in the post, promoting the book, they had a picture of me. And for those who are listening and can't see me, I mean, I'm heavily covered in tattoos, like 85% covered. It's just something that I love. And I don't care if you have no tattoos. I'm more concerned on what's going on the inside, not the outside. That's where my interest lies at. But I remember these, comments. It was only one on each post, but it was like, who would ever read a book from someone who looks like that? Like that would do that to their body. How could they know the first thing about spirituality if they're not honoring?
What a spiritual thing to say.
I know, right? And I'm like, wow, man. But luckily, it's like, you know what, dude? That's their shit, not mine. Like that's their business. That just shows me. And I'm not judging them. That's just, man, that's where they're at in their practice.
I kind of am.
I know. All right. I probably kind of did too.
Well, I would just bet that for every one of those, there's 100 who think, wow, I want to know what this guy has to say.
Yeah, that's true. They're leaning in.
This feels different.
True. But being a sensitive guy that I am, of course, I focus on that one comment and not the other 100 nice ones. I'm up at night, like 2 a.m., like, why does that person not like me? I'm a good guy. I'm just trying to help, man. But,
yeah. Well, you're coming from, a bigger playing field.
True.
And that's one of the other things I like about your book is that you get outside the lane here with, you talk about magic, you talk about psychedelics. Of course, that's dangerous territory for anybody who's in the recovery field.
Oh, I've caught a lot of shit for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about, these sort of wild card practices?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have not personally done psychedelics in I'd say over 10 years. However, I see that they can be a very spiritual thing. I mean, I host my own podcast on Ram Dass's network, so it'd be kind of silly for me to be, the kind of person that is anti-psychedelic. Even in my sobriety, even today, I am pro psychedelic use if, and that's a big if, it feels right for the person. It's all about context or set and setting and context. Why are you doing it? What's your intention? When I was younger, I had done psychedelics between mushrooms and acid easily over 100 times. But when I was doing it, it wasn't a means of dropping out. It was just like it made Tarantino films like more interesting, or Mr. Bungle music more interesting. Like watching Blue Velvet, like was a movie like that's crazy enough, but you watch that on acid, like forget about it.
Mr. Bungle is a psychedelic.
Yes. I actually was in a bus or an accident once where I crashed into the back of a bus. It put the hood of my car, it folded in half through my windshield. I was equal parts at fault. The bus driver stopped short. I was going fast. I was a senior in high school. And I remember I went to the hospital. Luckily, no one was hurt. But there was like a school dance that night, and we opted not to go. We went to a friend's house, and we dropped acid and listened to Mr. Bungle. And it's like the walls were bleeding. It was insane, dude. And, who drops acid after being in this? I mean, they had to bring a crane in to lift the bus up off of my car. It ripped my engine in half. They said if the hood was like an inch lower, we would have been decapitated. But fuck it, let's go listen to Mr. Bungle and drop acid. But anyways, that might not
be the best set and setting.
No, that was not, and that's hence like the walls were bleeding, and it was an interesting night to say the least. However, yeah, I've seen, and especially with ayahuasca, something I have not done, but I talk about a lot in chapter 2 with Gabor Mate, who is one of the world's most renowned addiction experts, and he is a big time pro advocate for it. But he also says only if you feel called to it. So I look at things like that, or even marijuana, which I don't smoke, but I look at these things as plant medicines, not drugs. To me, drugs are heroin and crack and cocaine, things that have no redeeming value to them, whatsoever. These other things, on the other hand, can, if they are done in a spiritual context or a context of going deeper. Are they necessary? I don't think so. Can they be beneficial? Absolutely. And Be Here Now, Ram Dass talks about his guru Maharaji, and Maharaji talks about how psychedelics exploded back in the whatever it was, like the early 60s, because here in the West we were and continue to be a very material culture, but for our consciousness expanding purposes, we needed a material way of going about it. But he went on to make the point that psychedelics are cool or good in the sense that they can get you in the room with Christ and you can see the face of Christ if you're so lucky, but you're going to have to leave at some point because that psychedelic's going to wear off. Whereas the trick is to find your way into that room so that you don't have to leave. And that's done through practices like meditation and through the stages like Ken, with his wonderful integral maps and quads and quadrants, Aquil, he lays it out very clearly for us. And there's so many different paths up the mountain, as we know. But and then regarding magic, I was fascinated to talk about that because I'm just fascinated by all things occult oriented, because that's the dark side supposedly, but it's not really. Like Damien Eccles was a gentleman I had who spoke to that, and I actually just did a workshop with him in New York City last weekend, and we're presenting together again next month out at Alex Gray's Cosm, which I love. I know we're all fans of Alex's, and he's become just such a wonderful friend thanks to Ken's introduction, and I've been honored to teach out there a number of times. But Damien, he spent 20 years of his life on death row for a crime he didn't commit, and 12 of those were in solitary confinement. And finally, he was let go on what's called the Alford plea, and we could do a whole podcast on that. But in a nutshell, he found his sanity through practices of magic, and that's magic with a K. And through people like Aleister Crowley, and I am in no means an expert on magic whatsoever, but I do find it very fascinating. But he also attributes his well-being, and he talks in that chapter about Zen Buddhism and mystic Christianity, and he finds the Bible, when read in a certain context, to be a very inspirational book. He's not a reborn Christian by any means. His major thing is magic. And he has a book coming out with Sounds True later this year. And it's called Magic. And I think the subtitle is something like The Practices That Help Save My Life Living on Death Row, something like that. And so, like I said, there's so many different means and methods of healing. And that's why, not only in this book, in my last two, I always include practices from different traditions and non-traditions, things that are not what you'd maybe consider, again, quote unquote, spiritual. Skateboarding, to me, if I am there in the moment, is an exceptionally spiritual practice. Being on my board, literally, it's like being in the Tao, like going with the flow, flowing.
Flow states.
Flow states, literally. And to state the obvious, like hiking or gardening, but then there's art, love making, all sorts of things. Like there's so many means to having these spiritual experiences, awakenings, the things that inspire us to keep going and to dig deeper and continue on our healing journey. And not only for ourselves, but so we can show up in the world and be better people for others, be of benefit to all beings. The Bodhisattva vows, I've taken them years ago. I don't call myself a Bodhisattva, but I do try to live as bodhisattvic, if that's a word, of a life as I can. Again, failing miserably every day, but I do put forth the effort. I do have the conscious intention every single day to the best of my ability.
That's beautiful.
And, Chris, is your teaching, it's so beautiful. Is it getting traction? Are you, what would you say about people receiving this? Also, just the nature of the spiritual lives of the people you're talking to.
Yeah. So, okay. So the interesting thing is that, yes, it definitely is. And what I love is that I get a lot of emails and a lot of messages on social media from all sorts of different people, age ranges, anywhere from 16, 15 to 70 or 80. You know, people that are reading these books or that have attended a talk or a workshop and were able to resonate. And that means the world to me. That shows me that, okay, man, mission accomplished. You're conveying or distilling down not just some of the wisdom teachings from the traditions, but you're presenting these various healing modalities and practices in a way that are accessible for people. Now, the catch-22, where punk rock and hardcore kind of bites me in the ass, is another part of those ethics that are deeply instilled are like, you don't sell out. And so, as you know, we know, there's a formula. If you want to hit the New York Times bestseller list, it's pretty much 1 + 1 = 2. I look at the spiritual books that are at the top of the list, and the majority of them I haven't read, but if I'm in a bookstore, you know, I'll flip through them, and it's like, all right, yeah, you're not really saying anything that anyone else hasn't already said. It's very watered down. And I was going to say I don't mean to talk shit, but I'm talking shit. Like, I'm a real person. And I think a lot of what is popular, and not to say all of it, because there is some very valuable stuff that has gained a lot of traction, is very valuable. But a lot of it does a sincere disservice. You know, a lot of it is spiritual bypassing. It's very watered down. It's McMindfulness. It's garbage. And so I don't want to write like that. I write about, you know, stuff that's not comfortable. I share practices that aren't comfortable. You know, and it's not that my books are dark and depressing. Like, I find I try to write from a humorous standpoint often. Like I said, I throw myself under the bus. I make jokes. Like, you know, it's the light and the dark, as Ken would say, the grace and grit. You know, they're both just two sides of the same coin. So I have a hard time with the whole marketing scheme and the whole promotional thing. I suck at that. So, I mean, if I was better at it, there would be more traction, but I'm shocked at like how well things do book-wise, or the events I've spoken at. It never ceases to amaze me when I'm invited or I'm speaking in front of 2,000 people. It's like, and I look to my left and right, and here are some of those teachers I may or may not have just shit talked. I'm not going to name names, but it's like, wow, like, and to me, I'm still just like this 11-year-old at heart who I'm looking over. I have a ton of Simpsons DVDs, like seasons on DVD, and The Office, and I laugh at completely inappropriate humor, and I still listen to punk and hardcore and metal, and I am who I am, you know, like I enjoy what I enjoy. I meditate daily. I have a dedicated spiritual practice. I honor my truth. And if say tomorrow I wake up and listening to punk and metal doesn't resonate, then I will lay it aside. If it's for a day, a week, a month, a year, the rest of my life, okay. But like, that's a gift of meditation and learning to be more intuitive with my inner self, and not just meditation, but mantra and prayer and all that.
Well, that's one of the things that I think, you know, multiplies the effect of your book, Chris, is that after every chapter you give a practice.
Yeah.
A real practice. With steps and drawings, and they're inspired by the download you got from the conversations that you've had and the transmission you've gotten. And damn, man, that helps me to, you know, really engage what it is you're talking about. So that was a good move.
Yeah.
Thank you. Again, inspired greatly by the ILP book, you know, which provides so many practices. But yeah, I mean, I'd been doing that with my first two, but I didn't do it this way. I wanted to, some of the practices are given to me they're direct transmissions from the teachers. Others are practices that I incorporated in, that I use, that I found were a nice complement to that chapter. So it's a mix of both, but either way, yes, it's like I said, like, here's a chapter, a conversation to help get the wheels spinning, to help hopefully help people see things from a different perspective, to remove any potential blinders. But most importantly, let's start doing the work.
Yeah.
That's where it happens.
Yeah. And Chris, I was going to ask about this because, you know, when you're dealing with addiction, really when you're dealing with any sort of brokenness, especially if you've sort of already taken the integral red pill and you know that things like integral life practice exists, and you know that there are solution sets out there, right? Or at least there are paths that you can take that will ultimately bring you a little bit closer to recovery.
Of course.
But the problem is, you know, in those moments of anguish, of temptation, of tapping out, really, you have a choice. And that choice is, you know, there's an easy choice and there's a really difficult choice. And the easy choice is to go unconscious, is to, you know, perpetuate whatever that habit is.
Of course.
Whatever your means.
Or to have a drink.
Or have a drink.
Absolutely.
Or light a joint, or, you know, tap your vein, or whatever it might be.
Right.
Or watch some porn, or, I mean, Jesus, we're surrounded by, you know, it's a sticky world and we get addicted to it very, very easily.
Speaking of porn, but anyways.
Yeah.
I said I'm so inappropriate. I had to. I could not. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I like that. But the other choice can feel fucking overwhelming. Right. I mean, you said it earlier. You said earlier, you know, it's like I have I go to the gym 6 days a week. I have a daily meditation practice. I do this shadow work. I've got these teachers that I get transmissions from. I do this, I do that, I do that, I do that. It's fucking overwhelming, right? To the point where, again, if I'm in that situation and I'm having that, you know, really difficult moment and I've got to make a choice, that overwhelm can actually push me towards making the less conscious choice.
Absolutely.
And so I'm wondering if you, you know, again, that's why it's important, I think, to provide actual bite-sized practices the way you do in your book, because it gives a breadcrumb trail, right? Yeah. It actually helps acclimate people to be like, no, there's a crack in the wall here. There's something I can walk through here and actually feel like I took a step forward. So, you know, what I was going to ask you is, you know, it's often sort of accepted that for someone who's struggling with addiction, they're not really going to be able to, they're not going to have the capacity, the inner resources to do anything about it until they basically, you know, hit rock bottom.
Which is bullshit.
So okay. So this is great. This is exactly what I wanted to ask you. So it's sort of left to that. It's like, well, we just have to wait for these people to completely fuck up their lives, right. Fuck up their relationships,
right.
You know, damage their kids, do, you know, whatever it might be, in order for them to get onto a path of recovery.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, what advice do you have for someone who might be watching right now and, you know, having their own struggles, who are challenged by the, you know, I mean, you really have to cultivate some serious willpower in order to engage, you know, the solutions, in order to even feel like you have a shot here.
Yeah.
It takes an incredible amount of volition, an incredible amount of willpower to turn that corner.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of specific advice for those.
Yeah. People. Well, that is such an important topic and wonderful points you made, Corey. Thank you for that. And I'm glad that you brought up, yes, I named like all these different things I do. So first, to address that, I didn't just wake up one morning and be like, you know what, here's like 10 things I'm going to do today and off to the races. Mm-hmm. No, it's like the person that goes to the gym and tries to like do it all in one day and either injures themselves or gets discouraged because they don't see results in a week. Mm-hmm. What I recommend for people, you know, if they're interested in this sort of thing, is find one thing. If you have no practice whatsoever, find one thing that you enjoy, or maybe you don't even enjoy, but you know over time will benefit you, and start there. Start slow, start easy. It's not like you're going to go to the gym and work your biceps out if you've never worked them with freaking 50-pound dumbbells. You know, you're going to start at like, depending on who you are, 5, 10, 15, 20 pounds. I don't know. But like, start where you are, start slowly, but dedicate yourself. So I'll often tell people, find 5 minutes a day to start a meditation practice. Even if it's a guided practice, whether it's Vipassana, you know, just breath, whatever, like 5 minutes a day. And if you can do 5 minutes at night too, awesome. But start there, something you can dedicate yourself to every day. Every day. Do something every day. And then over time, gradually increase it. Like, don't push yourself too hard, but don't slack. Like, it's like that Buddhist teaching of the woman playing the sitar or whatever. Like, she tunes the string too tight, it breaks. She doesn't tune it enough, it's too loose. She tunes it just right, the middle path. You walk the middle path. So that's my recommendation as far as like people that don't, and I'm assuming most people listening to this already have their practices, but in case anyone is tuning in that doesn't, just find something that you can, or a couple of things that work for you. Speaking specifically to the addiction and rock bottom thing, it's been shown, especially more recently, that our rock bottoms are what we make them. Unfortunately for me, yes, like I am that classic case study, the poster boy of rock bottom. Like I said, I don't need to rename it, but nearly dying numerous times, etc. Like addiction brought me there. But I've seen people who have not lost anything. They had enough. They did cross that line. It's essentially you start out with experimentation and then regular use, abuse, and then from there, the final stage is addiction. And once you cross that line from abuse to addiction, there's like 1 in a million that can go back and ever safely use a substance again. Right. God bless their souls. I've tried on numerous occasions. I'm that 1 in a million. Nope, unfortunately, I'm not. Yeah. But our rock bottom is what we make of it. And that being said, though, the thing is, it's very important for family members and friends of those who struggle with addiction to know is that you cannot force them to get better. It's not that they have to bottom out and lose their job or kids or whatever, but they have to be the ones who want to get better for themselves. And Gabor Mate speaks to that in the second chapter. He's like, essentially, you have two options. One is that either you are going to love this person unconditionally. You're going to let them know, I'm sorry that you are going through your experience and you're sharing in this family pain, because addiction of any sort is the result of something that's gone on in your life. Often it's attributed to childhood, and it doesn't mean it's a major trauma like molestation or something horrific. It can be several minor traumas, bullying, whatever the case may be. But, letting him know, look, as a family, we suffer, and we're sorry that you are experiencing your degree of suffering with addiction. That's one avenue. Because when you're telling them they're a bad person, or you're not accepting them, or you're judging them, that's just making them feel even shittier and making them want to use more. Like they already feel crummy enough. An addict does not feel good when they're using. Physically. No, when you're at the stages of addiction, you've resorted back to your reptilian brain. You're in survival mode. It's fight or flight. It's like, this is even to the point of death. You're no longer functioning from your neocortex rational mind. You are back in your caveman. This is going to keep me alive. It's odd. It's almost a form of very twisted compassion in a way, because it's been ingrained. I am in a significant amount of pain. This has helped relieve that pain before. Yeah. So it's pleasure pain. Yeah. So it's a weird form of compassion. I'm not saying that's an excuse to do it, but it's a very odd way. So the other option is, and Gabor makes it very clear that this is neither one is right or wrong, is to tell the person in your life, that person struggling, I love you. I'm sorry that you're experiencing the pain that you're experiencing. I am here to help you when you're ready to get help, but I cannot have this in my own life. Mm-hmm. And that's very hard for people. But people need to take care of themselves who aren't addicted, that have family members that are, so that they can be as healthy for themselves for when that addict or alcoholic or whatever, sex addict, overeater, whomever, is ready to get help, is ready to enter treatment, go to meetings, do whatever. Yep. So, and then speaking specifically to the addict, if someone's listening, or the alcoholic or whatever, all I can say is, my heart is with you. We do recover. It's just a matter of you making the decision, you and you alone. You can't do it for your kids. You can't do it for your wife, your girlfriend, your parents. They can be an inspiration, absolutely, but you have to do it for yourself first and foremost.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I have to say that I think that the spiritual path is a beautiful way out in the sense. I always think of something that Scott Peck said, the guy who wrote The Road Less Traveled. He said that addiction is a substitute for authentic spiritual experience.
Yes.
And addiction, you know, it softens the ego boundaries. I take a drink, I feel warm, I feel a little more connected. You know, I take my drug, whatever it might be. And so to have a spiritual path ready and waiting for people who make that decision is such a gift.
Yeah, I love that phrase, Jeff. And I would even, you know, at least the way I enact it, I would just, you know, I would say that addiction becomes a substitute for authentic experience, period. Whether spiritual or otherwise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely agreed. And I've experienced as well. I had a clinician once in a program tell me, he's like, you're trying to get from here to here, and here meaning like God realization, essentially, through the use of drugs. But he's like, if you don't have a stable foundation to build upon, which I don't, you know, it's this rocky, sandy, whatever, you can never get to this point. And even if I'm sober and I'm doing my practices, who knows? I've let go of striving to get anywhere. You know, it's just doing the best I can, being the best person I can. And one thing that came up for me as you were saying that is, I also tell people to be careful when they step on the spiritual path, because that can also be a means of aversion. You know, let me just go meditate, you know, do this guided meditation to feel like all blissful. And there's nothing wrong with feeling good and blissful, because love and light is absolutely part of it. But yeah, man, people use spiritual practices as a means of aversion and dropping out too. And that can become an addiction in and of its own. So it's always a fine line to walk with all things. You know, we have to keep ourselves in check and be real with ourselves about shit.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, you have given us some wonderful guidance here with your book, Dead Set on Living. There it is again, making the difficult but beautiful journey from fucking up to waking up.
I love that title.
I do too.
Thanks.
And I think a lot of people could relate.
Yep.
I really appreciate you being with us. Is there any place that people can go to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, if they just visit my website, you can find my social there. You can get in touch with me there. You can see my upcoming events. So I won't bother listing all of that. But the website itself is just theindiespiritualist.com. And indie is spelled INDIE. So one word, theindiespiritualist.com. And yeah, it's all right there. And I respond to every single email I get. Talk about DIY, those punk ethics, DIY, do it yourself. I'm still just one man, 3 books in, you know, several conferences and festivals and workshops. I handle everything myself, but God damn it, if I will not find this time to write back to somebody who writes to me, you know. So if someone's listened and inspired and wants to connect, it has a question, it may take me a day, it may take me a week, because the book did just launch. I'm hectic, but I absolutely 110% of the time always respond to anyone who gets in touch with me. So I'm fully accessible.
Right. I also really highly recommend that people check out Chris's dialogue with Ken Wilber. We actually have 2 of them, 3 of them, I think, really.
A whole bunch. Yeah.
The one I'm thinking of in particular is the Hardcore Spirit series.
Yeah.
Which is something like 7 hours or some ridiculous amount of time that you spent talking with Ken. It's a Q&A where you basically ask Ken questions that were submitted to you from your own sort of peers and your own network.
Yeah.
And you guys cover just a lot of ground. You know, from music to culture to art to addiction to spiritual practice, and you know, and you and Ken really vibe off each other in a really cool way. It's available on integrallife.com. I believe it's a pay what you want, so you know you can get it for $1, or you can give us, you know, $1,000 for it, whatever you feel it's worth. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that one. I love that one. I always love working with Ken and conversing with him. And I can't nap. I don't nap because if I nap, I'm not going to sleep. But that dialogue series was done in 2 parts, like 3.5 hours each conversation. And you guys know Ken as well as anyone. And after that, my mind was just so melted. I mean, it was a dialogue. It wasn't just me asking Ken questions. Like
right.
we got deep into it. But I remember at the end, I was like sweaty. Like I had to go lay down after both parts just because it's Ken,
Yeah.
and we went deep. But yeah, that's one of my most favorite things I've done, period. And conference-wise, speaking books, because yes, like you said, we covered so much, and Ken has such a eloquent, down-to-earth way, especially when speaking. I know his writing at times can be heady for some people, but I think that's a very accessible series. Yeah, so thanks
it's a great introduction to both of your.
Yeah, thank you.
Besides, getting your mind melted is a great practice.
Yes.
So it's a stage of the path.
I believe it's Alan Watts who said sometimes we have to lose our mind to come to our senses, and Ken helps me do that frequently. So, yes.
Me too. Hallelujah. Well, thank you, Chris. I'm very grateful to have you in the Integral community and to have you be doing your work, and look forward to much more to come.
Thank you, guys. I'm humbled, honored, and the pleasure was all mine. Thank you for the invitation and your presence.
All right. Thanks, Corey. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.